All right, Alexander, let's do another update on what's going on in Ukraine because we have a lot of activity taking place in Ukraine, specifically, once again, in Donbass, in the Bakhmut direction. Things are moving faster than I think we had anticipated from our video yesterday. I
Yeah.
mean, and a lot of analysts were thinking maybe this would be a 1 month thing in Bakhmut. It seemed inevitable that Bakhmut was going to fall and the Russians were going to take it. But I think the timeline was around 2 to 4 weeks.
Yes.
But it seems
Yes.
like things are moving a lot faster. What is going on?
Absolutely. I mean, we've had a whole string of reports now for settlements. And when we talk about settlements, I mean we're talking about large villages, but they are places which are essentially suburbs. They are Bakhmut suburbs. They've all been captured on the run by the Russians, one after the other. Now, usually, up to fairly recently, it would take, weeks for one of these places to be captured. The Russians took three in one day. They captured another one this morning. They've now cut the major road between Bakhmut and another place called Chasov Yar. Now, Chasov Yar was the place from whence reinforcements to Bakhmut used to go. So, in effect, one of the major supply routes to Bakhmut has now been cut. And Denis Pushilin, who is the head of the Donetsk People's Republic, who's an interesting man and usually reliable in what he says, he said yesterday that Bakhmut was on the brink of being completely encircled, and that's looking increasingly likely. Now, this morning, I saw a report, which I cannot confirm, that the Ukrainians are now starting to pull out of Bakhmut, that they've decided that the situation is becoming untenable, that they've left behind their territorial reserve troops to try and sort of cover the retreat, but that the best units, such as they are, apparently they've been very, very badly knocked about, that they're now being pulled out. Now, that's not a confirmed report, and one can't say for certain that that's happening. But one way or another, it does look as if the Battle of Bakhmut is coming towards some kind of a end. It's reached a kind of critical point. Ukrainian resistance there is becoming untenable. And perhaps worryingly for the Ukrainians, there seems to be a similar crisis, not quite on this scale, but it's beginning to develop in another part of Donbass, the Donetsk region. And that's in this village, it's a small town, Marinka, which is a suburb of Donetsk city. It's south of Bakhmut. The Russians apparently have largely captured that place. And Pushilin, the same person I was talking about, said that the Russians are going to liberate, as he put it, Ugledar very soon. So all of these three places, Bakhmut, Ugledar, Marinka, they're all looking like they're about to fall. Now, when I say about to fall, we've been here before. We've talked about Bakhmut on other occasions. It looked like we were getting sort of scattered reports that things were looking bad for the Ukrainians there, and they were able to hold out longer. But this time, it's looking much more concrete. And definitely, these places around Bakhmut, they do seem to be falling rapidly. And it seems definite that the road to Chasov Yar has now been cut.
Yeah, we have been here before, and we have seen that Ukraine was able to slow down the fall of Bakhmut. What do you credit for the sudden speed to which all of these villages, Bakhmut and Ugledar, are now seem to be in jeopardy? And by the way, on a side note, I even think that Russian President Putin mentioned that Ugledar will soon be, as the Russians put it, liberated.
Yes,
Don't
I think I've
I'm not
heard that before. I
100% on
haven't
that,
seen.
but I did.
No,
Yeah, I did kind of see. I haven't been able to
yeah, I see. No,
double or triple
no,
check that, but
exactly.
I'm just kind of throwing it out there. But why do you
Yeah,
think
yeah.
this has happened so quickly, and and
and
all of a
suddenly.
sudden?
Right, I think there are two reasons, and they are of course connected to each other. Firstly, Russian forces in Donbass have been vastly increased in number and striking power. We're getting more and more of those 300,000 troops and 80,000 volunteers joining the military in Donbass. That means there's an awful lot more Russian soldiers now in Donbass than there were, a few weeks ago. And they're backed by artillery, they're backed by enormous firepower because the Russians have been upgrading the sort of military units, the weaponry that they've been supplying. So up to this point, until fairly recently, it sounds incredible, but the Ukrainians actually outnumbered the Russians in Donbass, and specifically, believe it or not, in Bakhmut itself. We had a strange situation where the Russians were attacking Bakhmut. Bakhmut was fortified. The Russians were the attacking force. The Ukrainians were the defenders, relying on the fortifications. But the Ukrainians actually outnumbered the Russians, and that was why they were able to slow these Russian advances. That dynamic has changed. The Russians now outnumber the Ukrainians. They're able to throw far more artillery into all of this. They can do all of these things. So they've got the numbers behind them, which they haven't up to now. And the second thing that has changed is that they now have a unified command. I mean, if you remember, up to September, every single theatre of this war, the theatre commanders, the Russian theatre commanders, were fighting it as a private war by themselves. Now we've had General Surovikin, who's the overall commander. He's able to make strategic decisions. He took the decision to redeploy troops from the west of the Dnieper River in Kherson region to Donbass. He's able to set priorities. He's clearly made taking Bakhmut and these places around Donetsk, a priority. And so a unified command and far more troops, and it's achieved this breakthrough.
Right, because we're getting so much information so quickly
Yeah.
now. I also read another report saying that General Zaluzny from the Ukraine side had informed Zelensky that Bakhmut it can't be defended and they need to
Yes.
pull out.
Yes.
What does Ukraine do now? What does Zelensky do? Do you think he listens to Zaluzny? Does he perhaps maneuver to do something else?
Yeah, that's always the problem because, of course, this has been a recurring story. I mean, Zaluzny has been telling at various points in the war, he's been giving what looks like realistic advice to Zelensky, and Zelensky doesn't listen to that advice. He orders troops to hold out as long as they can. So that happened with Mariupol. That happened in Severodonetsk, Lysychansk. The result is Ukrainian losses have been higher than they needed to be. The result is that the defeat when it came was worse than it should have been. Now, I don't know what Zelensky is going to do, whether he's going to listen to what Zaluzhny says. The pattern has been for the Ukrainians to try to hold on as long as they can. And I suspect Zelensky's instinct will be to try to dig in Bakhmut, however bad the situation is. And I suspect that his further instinct will be to try to counterattack in some other place. And I think that's a real possibility. He could try to counterattack in Kharkiv region. Apparently a lot of Ukrainian troops there. He could try to counterattack in Zaporozhye. A lot of Ukrainian troops there as well. Problem is that the Russians seem to be ready for Ukrainian attacks in both places. One of the things that Surovikin, the new Russian commander, has been doing is apparently he's been very, very busy fortifying these positions in Zaporozhye and Kharkiv in anticipation of any Ukrainian attacks there. But, it's the kind of thing you can imagine Zelensky doing. Because, of course, if Bakhmut falls, if these places around Donetsk city fall, if it's starting to look as if the entire Ukrainian position in Donbass is starting to break down, then the narrative of victory which he's been selling to the Ukrainian people and to the West starts to collapse. And that, I think, especially with a president as obsessed with public relations as Zelensky is, it's going to be a very, very difficult thing for him to accept. He's going to want to try somehow to pull off something which will keep, the narrative running that Ukraine is winning this war, that it's even going to recapture Crimea, that it's going to achieve all of these things, even as that begins to become increasingly fanciful and indeed even ridiculous.
Right. Well, we forget sometimes when we talk about Zelensky. He's very much in a position where he has to fight for his life. I mean, he's surrounded by some nasty figures, some nasty characters on all sides. And so for him, he needs to keep this narrative going. He needs to keep the money flowing in. He needs to keep the weapons flowing in, the black market weapon sales flowing. I mean, for him, this is a matter of life and death for Zelensky. So he's, I'm sure he's feeling the heat right now. Yes. The missile strikes,
yes,
the kamikaze drone attacks. I have been getting reports once again from the Ukraine side of things that they are bracing for another wave of missiles and drone strikes.
Yes.
Do you think that's going to happen? And on top of what's going on in Donbass, Donetsk, Bakhmut, Ugledar?
Well, of course, the Russians don't share their plans with me. And, of course, this is all coming from the Ukrainians. So, but I'm going to say this, sooner or later, there will be another massive Russian missile and drone strike. And I agree. I think that at some point, this is going to be increasingly coordinated with the land offensive. It could be that there will be a major strike today. The Ukrainians have been talking about it. It could be that it'll be this week. The Ukrainians have been talking about that too. We will have to wait and see. But it will come. One way or another, it will come because the Russians are saying as much. I mean, there have been statements now from senior Russian officials saying that these attacks on the infrastructure will continue. I think they won't just continue. I think they will escalate. Just as the fighting escalates in Donbass, so we will see the missile war, the economic war, if you like, against Ukraine, the war against its energy and railway infrastructure, perhaps its bridges as well, that will start to come in ever bigger dimensions over the next few days, weeks, months.
Right. So the European Union, they're desperately trying to figure out ways to keep the citizens of Ukraine in Ukraine. I understand what they're doing. They're saying they're going to send hundreds of generators and they're going to send people to fix the electric grid. I understand, looking at the EU's actions, that they are panicky, though they won't admit it. They're panicking about a mass refugee inflow into the EU. So they're trying to figure out ways to just patch things up and keep Ukraine citizens who are going to be fleeing from the blackouts and the terrible situation that's developing in Ukraine into Europe. You have Macron traveling to DC, and he's going to meet with Biden, and he's going to talk about various issues. I'm sure Ukraine is one of them. He's also going to talk about the fact that he feels that the U.S. is ripping off the EU with the price of LNG. You have Moldova, which is also facing an energy crisis as well because of its electric grid being connected to Ukraine's electric grid. This is a bad situation all around that is developing for the collective West. Where do they go? Where do they go from here?
I completely agree, because they got no plan C. You see, plan A was the economic sanctions. That was going to provoke the political crisis in Moscow. It didn't, because the Russian economy sailed through the sanctions, something they didn't expect. Plan B, pour weapons into Ukraine, force the Russians to retreat in various places. This is going to create a crisis in Moscow. That's also going to cause Putin to fall or something of that kind. That hasn't happened. Now, the military situation is changing on the battlefields. Weapons stocks have become increasingly depleted. We're even getting reports now that the Pentagon is trying to tell the Ukrainians, slow down the amount of artillery you're using. You seem to think that we can supply you with our unlimited numbers of shells. We don't have unlimited numbers of shells to supply you. There've even been reports about this. I mean, that was in the New York Times. I mean, a ludicrous thing to tell Ukraine. I mean, how can the Ukrainians fight if they're facing 20 to 50,000 rounds a day from the Russians and they can only fire back 2,000? I mean, this is ludicrous things, but that's what the West is now. That's what the Americans are apparently now trying to tell the Ukrainians to do. The Europeans are quarrelling about the oil price cap. I read a big article in the Financial Times about the fact that they've actually been stepping up purchases of LNG from Russia. Russia is now apparently a major supplier of LNG to Europe, which again, it's not something we much have talked about. And they're running around trying to find solutions for the situation, the crisis in Ukraine. They don't have many weapons to send. They're trying to get the Israelis to send surface-to-air missiles. But again, that's not going to be anywhere near enough for what Ukraine is facing. They're talking about generators. Generators are not a solution to Ukraine's problem. You can't send enough generators to replace the collapse of your power grid. Somebody said that you need about 1 million generators to do that. We're talking about something like 200 or 300. And bear in mind, generators generate electricity by, burning oil. And supplies of oil are short in Ukraine. So, you're replacing one problem with another problem. So they're arguing with each other, they're engaging in recriminations, they have no real plan about what to do. The one thing that they won't do and cannot do is call Putin. Say, this is going badly wrong. We understand that this situation is reaching a crisis point. Let's talk. Let's see what your proposals are. And let's see to what extent we can satisfy them. That would be the right and proper thing to do. And telling Zelensky and, he's all these dangerous people that he's surrounded with, we're very sorry, but we've reached the limit of what we can do. We're going to have to negotiate with Putin, and we advise you to do the same. That would be a rational response from the Europeans to this situation. But of course, they can't do that. They're all invested in this Ukraine debacle. They're all invested in trying to achieve regime change in Moscow. So they're running around like headless chickens, trying to find something that they can do. Perhaps send a few more generators, perhaps send a few more missiles from Israel, perhaps come up with something or other. There was this new idea that Boeing has, of attaching a small bomb to a small jet engine. A sign, by the way, in my opinion, that they're running out of HIMARS missiles, which I've been hearing a lot about as well. Anyway, they're coming up with these bodges and compromises because they exclude from themselves the only thing that could rationally work, which is negotiations.
There is one person in the collective West who would talk to Putin, who would call him up. And that's the person that's traveling to meet with Biden. That's Macron. If there is one person that has kept an open line to Putin, it has been Macron. I'm not saying that they get along. No. I'm not saying that Putin agrees with him. I'm not saying that they see eye to eye. I'm not saying any of that. All I'm saying is that throughout this entire conflict, the only leader in the collective West that has called up Putin numerous times, I don't want to make it seem like it's every week, but say 3 to 4 times throughout this conflict, has been Macron. What do you think about that?
Well, yes. I mean, it is a fact that Putin has become very exasperated with Macron because Macron calls him up, talks about negotiations, never comes up with anything that Putin can work with. But it is a fact that as you're absolutely right, you say Macron has talked about the importance of negotiations. This is, in my opinion, Macron's last chance. He's going to go to Biden. The right thing for him to say to Biden is, look, Joe, this has gone as far as it can. We're facing defeat in Ukraine. We're facing collapse in Europe. We've got to sit down and talk. You've got to tell your hardliners, you've got to tell Blinken and Sullivan and Nuland and all these terrible people that this thing isn't working any longer, because European solidarity is going to start crumbling. The European economy is going to start crumbling. It's going to have a back effect on you at some point as well. And we've got to talk to Putin. We've got to put aside the whole regime change idea. We've got to put aside the idea of Ukraine ever joining NATO, Ukraine ever joining the EU. We've got to accept that most of eastern Ukraine is going to end up under Russian control. We've got to accept even that the Russians are going to establish some kind of political ascendancy in Kiev itself. But that's what we must do. We must cut that deal. Does Macron have the guts to do that? Does he have the intelligence and the political courage to talk straightforwardly to Biden in that way? Well, you shook your head, and so would I. I don't think he does. So, yes, he's kept lines of communication to Putin open, but I suspect that the reason he did that was that he wanted to accept Putin's terms of surrender. He never expected to be in the position that he would have to be the person passing on to Putin the West's, request that he accept our terms of surrender, if I could put it like that.
Okay, a final question. I've been reading over the past couple of days a few articles talking about how the Biden White House has achieved a strategic win in Ukraine. I'm not talking about only the war, but in general, they've achieved a type of strategic win. NATO is more unified than ever. The Russian military is in shambles. The Russian economy is in shambles. I mean, the talking points. The EU is severed from Russia, and now it's going to sever itself from Beijing as well. So the EU is also 100% in the pocket of the United States. Allies in the Pacific are also united against China. I mean, the general talking points that we've covered on this channel for over the past 9 months, I've seen them now kind of packaged together in various articles, specifically a Bloomberg article I read yesterday, which made those points. And I just think to myself, in order to avoid, for the United States, the Biden White House, in order to avoid another Afghanistan debacle, wouldn't it be best for Biden and the White House to just dump Ukraine?
Yes.
Dump it on the EU, cut it loose, claim a victory, use BBC, CNN, MSNBC to talk up all your achievements and everything you've done for NATO and for business and for bringing over European business to the United States and the damage that you've done to Russia and how you're now ready to take on China. All these things, just talk them up. Claim a victory and avoid what happened in Afghanistan. Wouldn't that be the best policy for the Biden White House at this moment?
Absolutely. And one got the sense a few weeks ago that there were some people murmuring, from the Pentagon principally, General Milley and people like that, suggesting that's the right thing to do. But of course, inevitably, the neocons opposed it and the neocons won. As they always do. The neocons always win these battles, internal battles in Washington. But you're absolutely right. That is what they should do. But of course, they're not going to do it because neocons never do that. What we're going to see instead, and there was an article in Bloomberg, which I saw about, looking to find, send F-16s, Patriot missiles, to all those kind of things. In other words, try to match Russia's escalation. And of course, that's an incredibly dangerous strategy, but that's the instinct that the neocons have. That's not just their instinct, that's what's going to be their demands. As Ukraine starts to crumble, as the problems in Europe start to grow, as that lovely narrative of America having achieved lots of things starts to fracture, because it is. I mean, once, a few months ago, I went along with that view. I too thought that the Americans had done rather well out of this crisis, that they had in fact succeeded in consolidating bloc discipline, for example, that they had indeed severed connections between Russia and Europe. And up to a point, they have. But
They have.
with every day now,
I mean, they've blown up pipelines. They have.
They've blown up pipelines. I know. With every day now, we're starting to see that the cost of that success is starting to grow. Now, logically, they should cash in their winnings and stop. But these people don't know how to stop. That's the trouble. As I said, what they're going to do instead is they're going to agitate for more to be sent to Ukraine, for more pressure on the Europeans, more pressure on the Europeans to break with the Chinese, and they're going to find some people in Europe who will support them.
Yeah, but Europe's going to break.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Europe is going to break
exactly.
in the end, yeah.
Exactly. But every single neocon venture has ended in this way. I mean, every single neocon venture that I can think of, they always start strong. There's always, claims that things are going incredibly well. Baghdad falls, Kabul falls. Also, we install the people we want. Everything's going our way, and then eventually, the problems accumulate. And the whole thing eventually unravels. And the thing about the neocons is they never learn from that. Always the lesson they take away is that the reason things have gone wrong is because we didn't escalate even more. And that's what they're going to be saying at the present time. They're going to be going around Washington. They'll be lobbying hard. They'll be lobbying relentlessly. They're going to say, well, look, we've got to stick with this. We've got to impose $30 price on Russian oil, which is what the Poles are saying. The Poles would not be saying this if they weren't getting some help, some support from Washington. The neocons in Washington are definitely talking to the Poles about this. You can be certain those discussions are taking place. And they're going to say, let's send the Ukrainians F-16s, let's send pilots with those F-16s, let's start trying to put more boots on the ground. They're going to do all of those things. And they have a president. We have a president in Washington who's both weak and very much under neocon influence. And is going to become increasingly so, because if investigations start to take off in Washington, because the Republicans are going to use control of the House to try to launch investigations, what we're going to see is that the president is going to become more dependent on the neocons and on their supporters to try to hold the line against the Republicans who are launching these investigations. So that's the danger. We're going to see doubling down rather than that correct policy of cashing in your winnings and moving on. The neocons never do that, and that's why everything they do fails.
Yeah, that's exactly what's going to happen. When all of this crumbles, when Project Ukraine crumbles, the neocons are going to say, we should have given Ukraine long-range missiles and nuclear weapons back in 2015. That's exactly what they're going to say. Yeah. I'm exaggerating it a lot, but that's their usual line. We should have done more in 2015, and we should have put troops in Ukraine, and NATO should have invaded back in 2015. We didn't do it. Next time, let's do things differently. That's exactly their line. Yeah.
Exactly. And by the way, I don't think you're exaggerating a lot. I don't think you're exaggerating at all. I would not be surprised if that's exactly what they say, that Ukraine should have been admitted into NATO back in 2015, that there should have been US troops put on the ground, that nuclear weapons should have been deployed there. I can already see the articles. I can read them already in my mind, coming out in Foreign Policy and National Review and all of these places.
Yeah. And just a final thought before we sign off. And the best part about having Biden in as president is that you're going to have someone that, when things do crumble, you can just throw it all on him.
Exactly.
Just like with Afghanistan times 10. Just throw it all on him. And you're going to probably have a president that 50-50, I'll say 50-50 is probably not going to run for re-election.
I agree with that.
I don't know
too.
what the odds are, but you can also that also works in their favor to throw it all
Absolutely.
on Biden. He's not going to run again anyway. He's a one-term president, so just throw it all on him.
I completely agree with every part of that.
Yeah. All right. We will end it there, theduran.locals.com. You can also find us on Rockfin as well, and go to the Duran shop, 10% off. Use the code GOOD DAY. Take care.